Hello, my name is Logan Wyatt, and today I'm going to be taking you through my Old Testament final project. I chose to talk about the contemporary and historical interpretations of the Exodus story, along with some other stories in the Old Testament. Alongside that, I also included some current events that I felt had significant parallels and uh, was very intertwined with what I'm going to be talking about today. First and foremost, I'm going to talk about the overview of the Exodus story. The Exodus story is a biblical event that I chose to exemplify. I chose this because I feel that the interpretation, both historically and contemporarily, are quite profound, and it offers a perspective both into the past events and their meaning, along with current interpretations and the gravity that it holds in our world today. Another reason that I chose this is because the Exodus events are quite imperative in the Old Testament for a few reasons. For example, Moses parts the Red Sea. The Ten Commandments or the 10 plagues are placed upon Egypt for their movements against God, and the Israelites journey to Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments. All of these activities occurred during the portion of the Old Testament and are super vital within the Christian faith. Next, I'm going to be getting into the historical interpretations of the Exodus story, along with some other stories that are similar. Something of historical significance in relation to the Exodus story that I found are the comparison of themes that can be drawn between the Babylonian exile and the exile of the Israelites. This can be directly related from the perspective of the Hebrew people, because what happened in Egypt with the Israelites is very, very similar to what ended up happening in Jerusalem, with people being taken out of Jerusalem and sent to Babylon because they were imprisoned, they were displaced. Although it is a little different because the Hebrew people were kind of going against God initially, and so like that they were punished. It's a little bit different in that light, but I do think that them being in that situation, they would feel the same. I think that, but in both instances, you feel like there's a wrongdoing being put upon you, and I think that is very, very significant moving forward with what I'm going to be talking about today. Basically, and alongside this, they were facing displacement from their land. They were basically also dealing with a loss of their sacred homeland, and they were having a longing for freedom from doing this wrongdoing. It's a little bit different. However, I do feel like the feeling is there. Like the feeling is exactly the same. Furthermore, even in this desperate situation, there is a message from God embedded in both of these stories, which is another instance of parallels that I find between them. That basically, despite their unfortunate circumstances, God promises redemption and restoration in the face of adversity, and at the end of this, it will pay off. And He promises that, and He does follow through. And in Exodus 3:12, it is stated, "I shall be with you." And I think that that's very, very important. That God says that because God doesn't say things just to say things. He says things like that because He means them. Next off, I'm going to be getting into the contemporary interpretations of the Exodus story, along with the Babylonia exile, along with some current events as well. Onto the contemporary interpretations. Something that instantly came to my mind in regards to the displacement of the Israelites in Egypt and the Hebrew people in Jerusalem is the millions of people displaced due to wars, conflicts, and oppression today. Uh, there are millions and millions of people around the world that are displaced today because of many, many different ideologies differing religious views, and all types of these problems. Today, we find ourselves bearing witness to these horrors that reside around us in this very moment. These issues are deeply intertwined with biblical beliefs and the disconnects that there lie. I would say that without a doubt, the people suffering in, for example, Gaza, Israel, and the Middle East as a whole could draw many parallels between their own issues and that of an Israelite in Egypt or a Hebrew in Jerusalem being exiled that way back when. I found this quote from a recent article about Gaza that says, "Over the last century, Gaza passed from British to Egyptian to Israeli military rule, and now fenced in an enclave inhabited by 2.3 million Palestinians, most of them refugees." And so this speaks, for me, absolute volumes about the likeness of these exiles, because we're looking at 2.3 million people that are basically fenced in prisoners that can't leave and are under like a harsh weight every single day from their government and other governments and military power. And I think that if they were to like look at the Exodus stories in both examples, I think that they would feel very similarly because they've had their land taken from them. They've been wronged, and I would imagine in their heart they don't feel like they've done anything wrong. Just like, let's say, the Hebrews didn't feel like they did anything wrong, or the Israelites, or even the Egyptians, because before the Egyptians were given the 10 plagues, I would imagine they besides imprisoning them, they didn't feel like they were doing anything wrong, because within their livelihoods, within their religion, within what they believed in their social hierarchies, that was okay, and that was what needed to be done. And so I think that that's always kind of a something that doesn't get necessarily recognized, but it's something that needs to be recognized, because that really, really explains why things happen the way that they happen. But I also feel that without a faith in God, and without knowing that God has your best uh, future in mind for each and every one of us, and for all of our individual peoples, that's when you start to have problems like the Egyptians faced with the plagues and things of that nature. And it's unfortunate, but even with today, like people are suffering, not because that they're living like the Egyptians, but because that they're maybe lacking a faith in God, or lacking living by the commandments that God gives us. And I think that that causes a lot of problems today. Next off, I want to be talking about the themes and the similarities across these interpretations, both historically and contemporarily. There's a multitude of similarities between the themes across the two differing interpretations of these passages. For example, in both of these interpretations, there's themes of resilience, faith, and liberation. In addition, both instances, God is the driving force behind the people being hindered, staying resilient, keeping their faith, and fighting towards liberation. I also feel that both contemporarily and historically, these groups would, hypothetically, if they could see what's going on today, they would feel similarities of their situations and what's going on today. And they would, like when it comes to being displaced, losing your homeland, being wronged, I would imagine they would look at something like what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in the Middle East with all these people, and they would be like, dang, that is very, very similar to what we're going through here and now. Obviously, that's maybe a lens that they couldn't see because they're way back when, but if they could, I think that both ways, both Gaza looking back at the Old Testament people, and people in the Old Testament looking at what's happening right now, there would just be a direct, intertwined feeling between the two of them because of what's going on. In Exodus, it states that, therefore, say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with the mighty acts of judgment, and I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. For me, this exemplifies the profound action taken by God and the motives behind them. It exemplifies his constant reassurance of his people and who he decides is his people because of their faith, his allocation of faith, and his recognition of faith in his people. Along with this, is an illustration of God's strength, because that's something I'd like to highlight on as well. I feel as if God's strength is something that maybe sometimes goes unnoticed, but God's strength is omnipotent. It's boundless. It's eternal. It's something that goes beyond what humans can comprehend. It's incomprehensible to someone with our facilities. And so I think that looking at an Old Testament story like this and recognizing what God did for his people and how much strength he has to be able to do the things that he did is when you start to recognize just an iota of the boundless strength that God has. And I think that that's very, very necessary in kind of developing your faith in religion and in God. Concludingly, although there are some differences between the two instances that I brought up, with the Old Testament being that the Jerusalem being exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon, and then with the Exodus from Egypt, there are some differences, obviously, with them defying God and then not defying God. But I do think that there are a lot of similarities betwixt the two, because you look at those two instances and you look at how somebody in that, like right in that instance, how in those shoes, how they would feel. They would look at each other and they would be like, this is going exactly the same for the two of us, not knowing that they're doing something wrong by God, because those Hebrews don't necessarily know that they're doing something wrong by God, because they have their own sets of rules and sets of laws and whatever they're going along with. Just like the Egyptians are going through their social hierarchy. They're going through what's regulated, what's allowed, what is propagated in their society, and they don't recognize that God is not happy with them, besides what Moses is telling them. They don't think that anything is going to happen to them wrongfully. And so, to add on to this, in regards to our current events taking place as we're talking, in the end, and overall, there is an underlying message. And that message is that we, as God's disciples, need to persevere. We need to maintain our faith in God, and we need to trust God and know that he has our best interests in mind. And to go back to what I was saying earlier about Exodus 3:12, God says, I shall be with you. And I really think that that's something found and is something that speaks volumes to God's love for each of us and all of us as God's people and God's children. Because no matter what, he will be with us. I feel very, very sorrowful for the people in Gaza and the people in the Middle East right now because of everything that's going on. It's horrendous to hear about the appalling acts that's going on with those people. But I think that's something, and it's obviously difficult, but I think something that they need to keep in mind is the fact that God is with them, and he shall be with them as long as they maintain that faith and they persevere, and they trust that God has everyone's best interest in mind. And obviously, there will be casualties and people will suffer because that's the nature of the world. That's the duality of good and evil. It's the duality of human beings. It's unfortunate, but it's the truth. And I think that no matter what, in life and death, in hardship or in happiness, I think that you have to recognize that God will be with you because of his omnipotent nature and because of the way he's exemplified his faith in the Old Testament with people like the Israelites, with people like the Hebrews. Obviously, those are similar people, but the way that he exemplifies himself throughout the entire Bible is something that is so profound to me because it really does exemplify the nature of God being with us. This is the end of my presentation. I appreciate you for watching and staying with me the whole time. I hope this was coherent and all of the quotations added to the point that I was trying to make, both contemporarily and historically. Uh, I appreciate you, Dr. Matthews, for always being there and being so helpful and cohesive this semester, and also teaching a very, very good Old Testament semester. Myself and my peers, obviously, were very, very engaged and happy throughout this semester. And I just wanted to say thank you very much, and I hope you have a fantastic summer. I'm going to transition over to the bibliography and the contents of the websites that I was using to get the information that I put into the slideshow. Um, Finally, just thank you so much.